The rain wasn't falling, it was attacking. Cold, sharp needles of water stabbed down from a bruised gray sky, turning the sidewalks of downtown into slick mirrors that reflected neon signs and the blurred headlights of passing cars. Puddles swallowed the cracks in the pavement, and the wind didn't just blow, it shoved, as if trying to push anyone foolish enough to be outside back into whatever shelter they'd crawled from. And there she was, standing just outside the warm glow of La Notte. A restaurant known more for its quiet elegance than its noise, she looked like a ghost that had wandered in from another world, 16 years old, though she could have passed for younger with her thin frame and wide, tired eyes. Her hoodie, once maybe navy blue, was now a patchwork of damp grays and faded blacks, stretched thin at the elbows. Her sneakers had split at the sides, held together more by hope than by thread, and her socks were soaked through, squelching softly every time she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She wasn't begging. Not exactly. She hadn't held out a cup or mumbled the usual lines people expected from kids like her. Spare change? Or anything helps. Instead, she stood just beyond the awning, watching the entrance like someone waiting for a sign. Her hands were tucked deep in her pockets, but not to keep warm. One hand clutched a small notebook, its cover bent and water-stained, pages swollen from past rainstorms. The other gripped a pencil stub worn down to almost nothing. Inside La Notte, the world was soft. Low lighting, the murmur of conversation, the gentle clink of wine glasses, the rich scent of garlic, rosemary, and slow-cooked tomatoes drifting through the slightly open door whenever someone entered or left. Piano music, recorded not live, played faintly in the background, smooth and polished, the kind of sound meant to soothe, not stir. But she didn't want soothing. She wanted to be heard. She'd been watching this place for 3 nights now. Not to steal, not to cause trouble, just to listen. Every Thursday, the restaurant hosted live piano. She'd stand across the street, pressed against the brick wall of a closed bookstore, ears straining through the rain and traffic noise, trying to catch every note that slipped out the door. She'd close her eyes and imagine her fingers on those keys, ivory and black, cool and smooth under her touch. She remembered what that felt like. Once, a long time ago, back when there was a small apartment with thin walls and a radiator that clanked like a heartbeat, back when her mother would hum while stirring soup on the stove, and sometimes, on good days, she'd sit at the old upright piano in the corner, the one with the chipped key and the wobbly bench, and play. Not fancy pieces, just simple things. Lullabies, folk songs, melodies made up on the spot about grocery lists or rainy afternoons. But to her it was magic. Then the cough started. Then the hospital visits. Then the silence. After that, the piano was sold. Then the apartment. Then everything. Now she slept in shifts, sometimes in the back room of a 24-hour laundromat where the night attendant took pity, sometimes under the overhang of a bus stop, wrapped in layers of newspaper and a donated blanket. She'd learned to read people's eyes, the ones who looked through her like she was air, the ones who glanced away quickly, the rare few who paused just a second too long. Tonight, she couldn't wait any longer. Her stomach had been growling for hours, a deep, hollow ache that made her dizzy if she stood too still. She'd tried dumpster diving behind a bakery earlier, but all she found were soggy cardboard boxes and a single moldy croissant. She'd eaten it anyway. Now the hunger was back, sharper, angrier. But it wasn't just food she needed. It was dignity. It was the chance to say, "I'm still here. I can still do something beautiful." She took a breath, wiped rain from her face with the back of her wrist, and stepped forward. The restaurant's entrance was framed by heavy wooden doors and a brass handle polished to a shine. A man in a dark vest and crisp white shirt stood just inside holding a clipboard. He was the gatekeeper, the one who decided who got a table, who got turned away, who belonged. She stopped a few feet from him, just outside the dry zone under the awning. Rain dripped from the ends of her hair onto her shoulders. He noticed her right away. His expression didn't harden, but it didn't soften either. It was practiced neutrality, the look of someone who'd seen it all and learned not to react. She swallowed. Her throat was dry despite the rain. "Excuse me," she said, her voice thin, almost lost in the drumming of water on the pavement. He turned slightly, eyebrows raised, waiting. She took another step, now standing in the doorway's shelter, water pooling around her shoes. I know this is weird." She started, her words coming out too fast. But I saw the sign. Live piano Thursdays, and I play, or I used to. She held up the notebook like proof. I wrote some stuff, not like Beethoven or anything, just my own things. The man didn't interrupt. He just watched her, arms loosely crossed. She rushed on, her voice cracking. I'm not asking for money. I swear, if I could play for 5 minutes, just 5, if people like it, maybe someone would buy me a plate of food, anything, pasta, bread, I don't care. Her eyes dropped to the floor, then flicked back up, desperate. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Silence. Behind him, the restaurant hummed. Laughter, the clatter of dishes, the low thrum of conversation. A waiter passed by with a tray of steaming risotto, the scent curling out like a taunt. The man studied her. Not with suspicion, but with something closer to caution. He'd seen kids try all kinds of tricks, fake injuries, sob stories, even staged fainting spells. But this girl, there was no performance in her posture. No rehearsed lines, just raw, trembling need, and something else. A quiet kind of pride buried deep, but still there, like she hated having to ask but had run out of other options. He glanced over his shoulder at the piano, a beautiful, glossy black grand near the far window, usually reserved for a regular performer who wouldn't arrive for another hour. The room was half full, mostly couples and small groups enjoying their meals. No one was paying attention to the doorway. He turned back to her. You really know how to play? She nodded fast. Since I was 6. My mom taught me. She's gone now. She didn't say more. Didn't need to, he hesitated. Company policy was clear. No unscheduled performers. No exceptions. But policy didn't account for a kid standing in the rain with hunger in her eyes and music in her hands. He sighed, rubbed the back of his neck. 5 minutes, he said finally, voice low. And if anyone complains, you stop right away. No arguing. Relief hit her like a wave. She almost stumbled. Thank you, she whispered so softly it was barely audible. Thank you, thank you. He stepped aside and gestured for her to follow. Stay close to the piano. Don't wander and try not to drip on the floor. She nodded, stepping carefully over the threshold, leaving a trail of wet footprints behind her. The warmth inside was almost painful after the cold. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, heavy and uncomfortable, but she didn't care. Her eyes locked onto the piano like it was a lifeline. As she walked through the dining room, a few heads turned. A woman in a red dress frowned slightly. An older man gave her a once-over and went back to his wine. Most didn't even notice, too wrapped up in their own conversations, their own lives. But she felt every glance like a touch. She reached the piano and stopped. The bench was smooth, polished wood. She ran a hand over it, then looked back at the man, who gave her a small nod. She sat. The keys were cool under her fingertips. She flexed her hands, chapped, red from the cold, nails bitten short. She hadn't played on a real piano in over a year. The last time was on a broken keyboard at the youth center, missing half its keys, but muscle memory doesn't forget. She opened her notebook to a page marked with a frayed ribbon. The notes were written in pencil, smudged in places, with little arrows and scribbled reminders in the margins. Slower here, add bass, like rain on tin roof. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began. The first note was soft, just a single, low C, held long enough to settle into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Then another, then a simple melody unfolded, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. It wasn't flashy, no thunderous chords or dizzying runs, just a quiet, aching tune that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere between memory and longing. Across the room, a waiter paused mid-step. At a corner table, a couple stopped talking. Near the bar, a man lowered his newspaper. No one knew what they were hearing. They just knew it felt true, and in that moment, the girl at the piano wasn't hungry anymore. She was home. The man who'd let her in stood just a few steps away from the piano, arms loosely folded, watching. He hadn't planned on this. Thursday nights were usually smooth, predictable. The regular pianist would arrive at 8, play soft jazz and light classical for 2 hours, and the guests would sip wine, eat handmade pasta, and leave feeling like they'd stepped into a scene from an old movie. Nothing unexpected, nothing messy, but this was messy and yet As the first few notes hung in the air, something shifted. It wasn't just the music, it was the silence that followed it. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but full. Like the whole room had leaned in without realizing it. He glanced around. A woman near the window who'd been scrolling on her phone moments before had set it face down on the table. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of her wine glass, unmoving. At another table, a man in a rumpled suit, clearly coming from a long day at work, had stopped mid-bite, fork hovering halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixed on the piano. Even the kitchen staff, visible through the pass-through window, had slowed down. One cook stood with a ladle in hand, staring. He turned back to the girl. She hadn't moved much. Her shoulders were hunched slightly as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. But her hands, those hands told a different story. They moved with a kind of quiet certainty, like they remembered a language the rest of her had forgotten. Each note wasn't just played, it was placed. Carefully, intentionally, like she was building something out of sound, brick by brick. He'd expected noise. Maybe a clumsy attempt at Für Elise or a pop song she'd heard on the radio. Something to justify giving her a plate of leftovers and sending her on her way. But this was something else entirely. It sounded like loneliness. Like walking alone at night under streetlights that flicker. Like the ache of missing someone so much it lives in your bones. But it also had moments of light. A rising phrase that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. A gentle run of notes that sounded like laughter remembered. He didn't know music. Couldn't tell a minor key from a major one. But he knew feeling. And this music had weight. A waiter approached him quietly, tray balanced on one palm. "Should I stop her?" he whispered, nodding toward the piano. "She's not on the schedule." He shook his head almost before the question was finished. "Give her the 5 minutes," he said, voice low. "Let her play." The waiter hesitated. "But Mr. Delaney's table is right there. You know how he gets about disruptions." He looked over at the corner booth where a silver-haired man sat with 2 younger companions, all in expensive-looking suits. Mr. Delaney was a regular, generous with tips but particular about atmosphere. He hated loud children, sudden noises, anything that broke the refined experience. But even Mr. Delaney wasn't scowling. He was listening. His wine glass was still raised, but he hadn't taken a sip. His eyes were on the girl, not with annoyance, but with something closer to curiosity. "Just keep service smooth," the man said to the waiter, "and hold off on clearing plates near the piano. Let her have space." The waiter nodded and moved away. Back at the keys, the girl hadn't noticed any of this. She was somewhere else now, deep inside the music where the rain and hunger and fear couldn't reach her. Her fingers found a new section of the piece, one that started slow but built into something stronger. A melody that didn't just ache, it reached. Like a hand stretching out in the dark, hoping someone would take it. At the bar, a man who'd been nursing a whiskey set his glass down. He was older, with tired eyes and a worn leather jacket. He'd come in looking like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now he sat up a little straighter. He didn't wipe his eyes, but his jaw tightened. And he stared into the middle distance like he was seeing something far away. Maybe a memory. Maybe a regret. Near the entrance, a young couple had just been seated. The woman had been mid-complaint about the wait time when the music started. Now she'd gone quiet. Her hand, which had been tapping impatiently on the table, lay still. She looked at her partner, then at the piano, then back again, as if trying to understand how a stranger's song could suddenly feel so personal. The man at the door watched all of this unfold like a slow-motion wave. He'd worked in restaurants for 15 years. Seen proposals, breakups, birthday surprises, even a small wedding once. But he'd never seen a room change so completely, so quietly in under 2 minutes. He checked his watch. 3 minutes in. She still had 2 more. He wondered what would happen when the time was up. Would she stop? Would she ask for food? Would anyone offer? He hoped so. Because right now in this warm, softly lit room filled with people who paid good money to feel something elegant and distant, a girl in soaked clothes was giving them something real. And it cost her everything. Inside the kitchen, the head chef had stepped away from the stove. He'd been plating a delicate sea bass with saffron risotto when the music drifted in. At first he'd ignored it, background noise, he thought. But then the rhythm changed. It wasn't the usual smooth jazz. This had edges, grit, soul. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked to the pass-through. Through the opening, he could see her, the small figure at the piano, back straight now, playing like her life depended on it. He'd grown up in a village where music wasn't something you paid for, it was something you lived. His grandmother used to sing while kneading dough, her voice rough but full of joy. He hadn't heard anything that honest in years. He turned to his sous chef. "When she's done," he said quietly, "bring her back here. I'll make her something." The sous chef raised an eyebrow. "She's not staff. And she's dripping on the floor." "I don't care," the chef said, already turning back to his station. "Just bring her back." At the piano, the girl reached the heart of her piece. This was the part she'd written the night her mother's breathing had grown too shallow, too slow. The night she'd sat on the floor of the hospital hallway, knees pulled to her chest, humming to herself because the silence was too loud. She'd come home and poured all of it into these notes, the fear, the love, the helplessness, the stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, beauty could still exist in the middle of pain. Her right hand played a repeating pattern, gentle like a heartbeat. Her left hand wove a melody above it, rising and falling like breath. It wasn't perfect. One note came out flat. Another was a fraction too slow. But no one noticed. No one cared. Because what they heard wasn't the mistakes. They heard the truth. A woman 2 tables away reached for her napkin and dabbed at her eyes. Not dramatically. Just a quick, quiet motion, like she was surprised by her own reaction. Her husband reached over and covered her hand with his. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. At the bar, the older man finally took a breath. He signaled the bartender not for another drink, but for a pen and a napkin. He scribbled something quickly, folded it, and set it on the edge of the counter. "Give this to her after," he said, voice rough. "Don't say it's from me." The bartender nodded, used to odd requests. But he tucked the note into his pocket carefully, like it mattered. Back at the piano, the girl didn't know any of this was happening. She was lost in the final passage of her song, the part where the rain stops and for just a moment the world is still. The notes grew softer, slower, until only a single thread of sound remained. Then silence. She let her hands rest on the keys. Didn't move. Didn't look up. The room stayed quiet. No one clapped. Not yet, it felt too soon. Too small a gesture for what they'd just witnessed. Then from the back, a chair scraped softly against the floor. One man stood, then another, then a woman near the window. Soon, half the room was on their feet, not in a roaring ovation, but in a slow, respectful rise like people standing for a moment of silence at a memorial. It was quiet reverence, not celebration. The girl finally looked up. Her eyes widened. She blinked as if waking from a dream. Confusion flickered across her face, then disbelief. Then something close to fear. She shrank back slightly like she expected to be scolded for taking up space. But no one spoke harshly. No one shooed her away. Instead, the man who'd let her in stepped forward. He didn't smile, but his expression had softened. That was something," he said simply. She swallowed. I can go now," she whispered, starting to rise. "No," he said gently. "Wait." He turned and gestured to a nearby table, one that had just been vacated. A server quickly cleared the dishes, wiped the surface, and pulled out a chair. "Sit," the man said. "You've earned your meal." She hesitated, glancing around at all the eyes on her. But there was no judgment in them now, only kindness, wonder. A few people gave her small, encouraging nods. She walked to the table slowly, her wet shoes squeaking faintly on the tile. She sat down, hands folded in her lap, looking like she wasn't sure whether to believe this was real. Within minutes, a plate arrived, not just a bowl of soup or a slice of bread, but a full plate. Steaming fettuccine alfredo with grilled chicken, a side of garlic bread, a small salad, and a glass of water with a lemon wedge. The chef had even added a sprig of fresh parsley on top, not for show, but as a quiet welcome. She stared at it like it might vanish. Then, without a word, she picked up the fork. Her hands were still shaking, not from cold now, but from emotion. She took a bite, chewed slowly, closed her eyes. It tasted like more than food. It tasted like someone had seen her. And in that moment, sitting alone at a table in a room full of strangers who had just been moved by her music, she didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt human. Outside, the rain kept falling, But inside La Notte, something had changed. Not just for her, but for everyone who'd been listening. Because sometimes it takes a single voice, raw, unpolished, and real, to remind us what it means to be alive. The first bite tasted like warmth. Not just the heat of the food, though the pasta was perfectly cooked, creamy and rich with butter and parmesan, but the kind of warmth that spreads from your stomach to your chest. Like someone had wrapped a blanket around your heart. She ate slowly at first, almost afraid that if she moved too fast it would all disappear. But with each forkful, the tight knot in her stomach began to loosen. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing evened out. She kept her eyes down, focused on the plate, but she could feel the room around her. The quiet hum of conversation returning. Softer now, more thoughtful. No one was staring openly, but she knew they were aware of her. And for once, that didn't feel like a threat. It felt like she belonged, even if just for a little while. A server came by and refilled her water glass without being asked. Another placed a small basket of fresh bread on the table, still warm, crust crackling slightly as steam escaped. She reached for a piece, broke it in half, and held it in her hands for a moment, letting the heat soak into her palms. It reminded her of Sunday mornings long ago, when her mother would buy a loaf from the corner bakery and they'd eat it with jam, sitting on the fire escape watching the city wake up. She took a bite. The bread was simple but perfect. She almost cried, but she didn't. She swallowed hard and kept eating. Across the room, the older man in the leather jacket finally stood. He walked slowly toward the piano, not with swagger, but with the careful steps of someone who'd carried pain for a long time. He didn't look at the girl. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. A harmonica, its metal dulled with age. He set it gently on the piano bench next to her notebook, then turned and walked out without a word. The bell above the door jingled softly behind him. No one said anything. But a few people watched him go, understanding passing between them without words. At the bar, the bartender unfolded the napkin the man had left behind. He read it quickly, then tucked it into his apron. Later, he'd give it to the girl. It said only, "Keep playing. The world needs to hear this." Meanwhile, the man who'd let her in stood near the host stand watching her eat. He'd expected her to bolt after a few bites. Street kids often did, used to being chased off or scolded for lingering. But she stayed. Ate with quiet gratitude like every bite mattered, and maybe it did. He glanced at his watch. The regular pianist would be here soon. He'd have to figure out what to do then. But for now, he let the moment breathe. Then something unexpected happened. From a table near the back, a woman stood. She wasn't flashy. Mid-40s, simple blouse, silver streaks in her hair. She walked over to the girl's table and stopped a few feet away. The girl looked up, fork halfway to her mouth, eyes wide with caution. The woman didn't smile too big. Didn't gush. She just said, "That piece you played, did you write it yourself?" The girl nodded, setting her fork down. "Yeah, it's called Bread and Rain." The woman's eyes softened. "It's beautiful, really. I teach music at the community center downtown. We have a piano lab, old, but it works. If you ever want to practice, you're welcome to come by." "No charge," the girl blinked. "You'd let me just come?" "Any weekday afternoon," the woman said. "Ask for the music room. Tell them I said it's okay." She pulled a small card from her purse and placed it on the edge of the table. "My number's there too, if you need anything." Then she turned and walked back to her table, as if she'd just offered directions to the nearest bus stop, not a lifeline. The girl stared at the card like it was made of gold. A few minutes later, another person approached, a man in his 30s wearing a flannel shirt and glasses. He held a small digital recorder in his hand. "I'm with the local paper," he said gently. "I don't want to intrude, but would you mind if I wrote about tonight? Not your name if you don't want. Just the moment." She hesitated. Cameras and reporters made her nervous. She'd seen how stories could twist, how people turned real pain into entertainment. But this man didn't seem like that. His eyes were kind, respectful. "Just don't make it sound like I was begging," she said quietly. "I just wanted to play." "I won't," he promised. "I'll call it the 5 minutes that changed a room." She gave a small nod. He thanked her and stepped back, already jotting notes in a small notebook. Word began to spread. Not loudly, but like ripples in water. A couple at the bar told their friends. A server mentioned it to the dishwasher in the back. By the time dessert menus came out, Half the staff knew what had happened. In the kitchen, the chef plated a small dish of tiramisu, light, dusted with cocoa, a single raspberry on the side. He handed it to a server. "For the piano girl," he said. "Tell her it's from the kitchen." When it arrived, she stared at it like it was a miracle. "I didn't order dessert," she said. "It's a gift," the server replied with a small smile. "You earned it." She took a spoonful. The coffee and mascarpone melted on her tongue, rich and bittersweet. She closed her eyes again. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about where she'd sleep tonight or how she'd find her next meal. She was just here, present, full in more ways than one. Then the front door opened. A man in a neat suit walked in carrying a violin case. He checked his watch, nodded to the host, and headed toward the piano. The regular performer. The room tensed slightly. The girl saw him coming and immediately pushed her chair back, standing up. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, voice tight with panic. "I didn't mean to take your spot." "I'll go." But the pianist, tall with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, stopped and looked at her. He'd heard the tail end of her playing from outside. He'd stood on the sidewalk for nearly a minute, listening through the glass, stunned. He didn't look angry. He looked moved. "You played that?" he asked. She nodded, eyes downcast. He walked over to the piano, picked up her notebook, and flipped through a few pages. The handwriting was messy, the notation imperfect, but the emotion leapt off the page. He handed it back gently. "Sit," he said. "Finish your dessert." She hesitated. "I mean it," he added. "You've got a gift. Don't waste it by running away the second things get good." She sat back down slowly. He turned to the man by the host stand. "Let her stay. I'll play over by the bar tonight. Give her the piano." The man raised his eyebrows but didn't argue. "You sure?" "I'm sure." And just like that, the grand piano remained hers. As the new pianist set up at the smaller keyboard near the bar, soft jazz filling the room now, the girl finished her tiramisu in silence. No one rushed her. No one asked for the table. She was allowed to simply be. When she was done, she carefully folded her napkin and placed it beside her empty plate. She stood, brushed her hands on her jeans, and walked back to the piano. Not to play, just to collect her notebook. But as she reached for it, she paused. On the bench, next to where the harmonica had been, someone had left a single red rose. No note, just the flower, its petals velvety and deep, still damp from the rain outside. She picked it up gently, holding it like something sacred. Then, without thinking, she sat back down at the piano. The room quieted again. She didn't plan to play. She just needed to say thank you, in the only language she truly trusted. Her fingers found the keys. This time she played something lighter, a short, sweet melody she'd made up years ago, one her mother used to call sunshine soup. It was simple, cheerful, full of little skips and trills like birds hopping on a fence at dawn. People smiled. A child at a nearby table clapped softly. An elderly couple held hands under the table. When she finished, she stood, notebook in one hand, rose in the other. She walked toward the exit, but before she reached the door, the man who'd let her in stepped forward. "Wait," he said. He held out a to-go box. "Leftovers and—" "Here." He pressed a folded $20 bill into her palm. "For a warm bed tonight? Or a bus ticket?" "Whatever you need." She looked at the money, then at him. "I can't." "You can," he said firmly. "And you will." She nodded, tears finally spilling over. She didn't wipe them away. She just tucked the money into her pocket, held the rose close, and stepped out into the rain. But this time, the rain felt different. It wasn't attacking anymore. It was just falling. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone in it. The rain had softened by the time she stepped back onto the sidewalk. It wasn't a downpour anymore, just a gentle hush, like the city itself was sighing after holding its breath too long. She stood under the awning for a moment, the warmth of the restaurant still clinging to her skin, the rose cradled in one hand, the to-go box tucked under her arm like a secret treasure. The $20 bill in her pocket felt heavy, not because of its weight, but because it carried something rare. Trust. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could still feel the quiet hum of that room behind her, the way the air had changed, the way strangers had leaned in not out of pity, but out of recognition. Like they'd heard a truth they'd forgotten they knew. She walked slowly, not toward the usual places, the bus stop bench, the laundromat alley, the overhang near the closed pharmacy, but just walked, letting her feet decide. The streets were quieter now. Most people tucked inside, dry and fed. Neon signs reflected in puddles like scattered stars. A distant siren wailed, then faded. Somewhere a dog barked. Normal city sounds. But tonight they felt different. Softer. Kinder. She passed a small park, its iron gates locked for the night. Through the bars, she saw an empty bench under a street lamp, dry beneath the branches of an old oak tree. On impulse, she turned and sat on the curb just outside the gate. She set the to-go box on her lap and opened it. Inside, more pasta, a piece of garlic bread wrapped in foil, and a small container of tiramisu she hadn't noticed before. She smiled faintly. They'd given her enough for 2 meals. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching her breath fog in the cool air. The rose rested beside her, its petals glistening with raindrops. She touched one gently. It smelled like earth and sweetness, like hope if hope had a scent. As she ate, her mind wandered back to the piano. Not the fear before she played, but the moment after. The silence that wasn't empty but full. The way the room had held its breath with her. She'd expected judgment. Maybe laughter. At best, indifference. But instead, she'd been met with something she hadn't felt in years, seen. Not as a problem. Not as a nuisance, but as a person. And not just any person, a creator. Someone with something to offer. She finished eating, wrapped the leftovers carefully, and tucked the box into her bag. Then she stood, brushed off her jeans, and kept walking. She didn't have a phone, so she couldn't check the time. But she knew it was late, past the hour when most shelters locked their doors. Still, she headed toward the one she knew, the old church basement on 7th Street. They sometimes left a cot in the hallway for latecomers if space ran out inside. But as she turned the corner onto 7th, she stopped. There, leaning against the brick wall near the church steps, was a man she recognized. Not by name, she didn't know names, but by presence. He was the night security guard from the community center downtown, the one who sometimes let her sit in the lobby when it rained, as long as she stayed quiet and didn't touch anything. He'd never spoken much, just nodded when she came in, handed her a cup of water once when she looked dizzy. Now he straightened as he saw her. "Hey," he said, voice low. "You okay?" She nodded. "Yeah, just heading in." He glanced at the church door, then back at her. "They're full tonight. Turned away 3 kids already." Her stomach dropped. She hadn't eaten in a day before tonight, but now the thought of sleeping outside again, wet, cold, exposed, felt heavier than before. Maybe because she'd just been warm. Maybe because she'd just been treated like she mattered. He studied her for a moment. Then he jerked his chin toward the street. "Come on," she hesitated. "Where?" "My van's around the block. It's not much, but it's dry, and I've got an extra blanket." She didn't move right away. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford often. But this man, he'd never asked for anything. Never even looked at her like she was less. "Why?" she asked quietly. He shrugged. "Saw you on the news." She blinked. "What?" He pulled out a small, battered phone and tapped the screen. Handed it to her. There on a local news site was a short article. "Mystery pianist moves diners at downtown restaurant." No photo of her face, just a blurred shot from behind. Sitting at the piano, rain streaking the window behind her. The story quoted a few diners, mentioned the music teacher's offer, the chef's meal, the quiet standing ovation. It called her a voice the city didn't know it was missing. She handed the phone back, stunned. I didn't know anyone would write about it." "People talk," he said simply, "and sometimes they listen." He led her to a white work van parked under a flickering streetlight. The back was empty except for a rolled-up sleeping bag, a toolbox, and a small space heater plugged into the cigarette lighter. He tossed her the blanket, thick fleece still warm from being folded near the heater. "Lock the doors if you need to," he said, handing her the keys. "I'll be back at 6. You can stay till then." She climbed in, the metal floor cool under her shoes. She closed the doors, and the world outside muffled instantly. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, curled up on the bench seat, and held the rose close. For the first time in months, she didn't check every shadow, didn't listen for footsteps, didn't plan an escape route. She just rested. Back at the restaurant, the night wound down. Diners left in ones and twos, many glancing at the piano as they passed, as if hoping she might still be there. The staff cleaned up slowly, lingering longer than usual. The chef stayed late, reworking a new dish in his head, something simple, honest, like her music. The music teacher sat at the bar, nursing a glass of wine, replaying the melody in her mind. She'd taught for 20 years, trained dozens of students for recitals and competitions. But tonight she'd heard something no conservatory could teach. Raw, unfiltered truth. She made a note in her planner. Ask about outreach programs. Maybe start a free workshop. At home, the journalist typed up his piece, careful with every word. He didn't call her homeless, he didn't dramatize her pain. He wrote about courage, about art that doesn't need a stage to matter. He titled it, 5 Minutes of Truth. And the older man in the leather jacket? He walked 10 blocks in the rain to a small apartment above a laundromat. He dug out an old shoebox from the back of his closet, filled with sheet music yellowed with age. He picked out a few pieces, ones about resilience, about light after darkness. He sealed them in an envelope and wrote on the front, "For the piano girl. Keep going." He'd drop it off at the restaurant tomorrow. The next morning, she woke before dawn. The van was cold, but she was dry. She folded the blanket neatly, placed the rose on the passenger seat and slipped out quietly, locking the doors behind her. She walked to the community center, the card from the music teacher clutched in her hand. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. The city felt new. She found the side entrance, knocked softly. A woman answered, different from last night but kind-eyed. "Can I help you?" "I was told to ask for the music room," she said, holding out the card. The woman read it, then smiled. "Ah, you're the one. Come in." Inside, the room was small but bright. An upright piano sat in the corner, slightly out of tune but clean. Sheet music stacked on a shelf, a metronome ticking softly on the stand. "Play anything you like," the woman said. "As long as you want." She sat, placed her hands on the keys, took a breath and played, not for food this time, not for survival, but because she could, because someone had reminded her that her voice mattered. And as the first notes filled the room, she knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of the community center, soft and golden, catching dust motes as they floated in the air like tiny stars. The piano in the corner wasn't fancy. Its wood was scratched, one leg slightly uneven, and the middle C key stuck if you didn't press it just right. But to her, it was perfect. It was hers. For now, at least. She'd been playing for nearly an hour. Not the same piece from last night. This one was newer, rougher around the edges, still taking shape in her mind as her fingers moved across the keys. It started slow, like footsteps on an empty street at dawn, then built into something brighter. A melody that didn't just remember pain but carried it forward, like a seed pushing through cracked concrete toward the sun. The woman who'd let her in sat quietly in a folding chair near the door, grading papers, but every so often she'd look up and just listen. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice. She knew better. Some music isn't meant to be fixed, it's meant to be felt. When the girl finally stopped, her hands resting lightly on the keys, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It hummed with something unspoken. "That one has wings," the woman said softly. The girl looked up, surprised. "It's not finished." "Good," the woman replied. "Some things shouldn't be rushed." She stood and walked over, setting a paper cup of hot tea on the piano lid. "Chamomile. Helps with the nerves." "I'm not nervous," the girl said, but her fingers trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the cup. "You don't have to be," the woman said gently, "but it's okay if you are." They sat in comfortable quiet for a few minutes, steam curling from the cups, the city slowly waking up outside. Then the woman said, "There's a shelter downtown that partners with us. They have a program for young people, housing, counseling, help getting back in school or training. They've got a spot open. If you're interested." The girl stared into her tea. She'd heard promises before, offers that came with strings or vanished by morning. But this didn't feel like that. This felt, "Steady, would I have to stop coming here?" she asked. "Never," the woman said, smiling. "This piano's got your name on it now." Later that day, she stood outside a brick building with a green awning and a sign that read, "Horizon House, Youth Support and Housing." It didn't look like a shelter. It looked like a home. Flowers in window boxes. A welcome mat. A bike leaning against the wall. She knocked. A young man opened the door wearing a hoodie and holding a mug. He looked like he might have been in her shoes not too long ago. "You here for the room?" he asked. She nodded. "Come on in. They've been waiting for you." Inside it was warm and clean. Not sterile, but lived in. Posters on the walls. Movie quotes, hand-drawn art, a calendar marked with group meetings and meal times. The smell of coffee and toast drifted from the kitchen. A woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair met her in the hallway. "We heard what you did last night," she said, not with awe but with quiet respect. "You've got a safe place here as long as you need it." They showed her a small room, just a bed, a desk, a closet, and a window that opened. No lock on the door, but a sign on the wall that read, "Your space. Your rules." She set her bag down. It felt strange to have a place where she could leave things and come back to find them still there. That evening, after a simple dinner of soup and bread with the other residents, some quiet, some chatty, all carrying their own invisible weights, she walked back to the community center. The music teacher was waiting. "I spoke with a friend," she said. "He runs a small recording studio, volunteers his time for local artists who can't afford it. He'd like to record your piece, just for you. No pressure, no audience, just so you have it." The girl's breath caught. "Record it?" "Yeah, so you can hear yourself the way we heard you. Clear, true." She didn't say yes right away. She thought about it, about what it meant to preserve something so personal, but then she remembered the rose, the harmonica, the standing room of strangers who'd cried without shame. Maybe her music wasn't just hers anymore. Maybe it belonged to anyone who needed to hear it. "Okay," she said. 2 days later, she sat in a dimly lit studio, headphones on, hands resting on a keyboard that felt smoother than any she'd ever touched. The engineer, a quiet man with a beard and gentle hands, gave her a thumbs up through the glass. "Just play like no one's listening," he said over the intercom. She closed her eyes and played Bread and Rain one more time. This time there were no hungry stomachs, no wet clothes, no fear of being turned away. Just her, the keys, and the memory of a rainy night when the world leaned in and said, "We hear you." When she finished, the engineer was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "That's not just a song. That's a gift." He burned a CD for her, just one copy, plain white label, no title, just her initials in pencil. MR. She held it like it was made of glass. Word kept spreading, but quietly, through community boards, local radio, word of mouth. A coffee shop downtown asked if she'd play for an hour on Sunday afternoons. Not for tips, just for atmosphere. They'd pay her $20 and give her a free meal. She said yes. Her first gig there, she wore clean jeans and a borrowed sweater. Her hands still shook a little as she sat down, but the moment she touched the keys, the fear melted. People sipped lattes, typed on laptops, chatted with friends, but every so often, someone would pause, look up, and just listen. And when she finished a piece, they'd nod or smile or say, "That was lovely." No standing ovations. No tears, just quiet appreciation. And that was enough. One afternoon, the chef from the restaurant walked in. He didn't say much, just ordered a coffee, sat in the back, and listened. When she took a break, he handed her a small envelope. Inside, a gift card to a music store and a note that read, "For new sheet music. And maybe socks that don't leak." She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. Back at Horizon House, things began to shift. She started eating regular meals, slept through the night without flinching at every sound. She signed up for a GED prep class, not because someone told her to, but because she wanted to, because she was starting to believe she had a future worth preparing for. One evening, while doing homework at the kitchen table, another resident, a boy about her age, sat down across from her. He'd been quiet since he arrived, rarely speaking. "You're the piano girl, right?" he asked. She nodded. He fiddled with his pen. "I used to draw. Before everything. But I haven't in months." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Feels pointless," he mumbled. Like no one cares. She thought about that. Then she said, "Last week a woman came up to me after I played. She said my music reminded her of her daughter, who passed last year. She said it helped her feel close to her again." She paused. "Art isn't about being seen. It's about being true. And sometimes, that's enough to help someone else breathe." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he went to his room and came back with a sketchbook. He didn't show her what was inside, but the next day he was drawing again. The music teacher helped her apply for a small grant, local arts funding for young creators without resources. It wasn't much, but it covered a month's rent at Horizon House and bought her a second-hand keyboard she could keep in her room. Now, when the night got too quiet, she didn't lie awake staring at the ceiling. She played softly, just for herself. But sometimes other residents would gather outside her door, listening, not knocking. Just standing there, letting the music wrap around them like a blanket. One rainy afternoon, much like the one that started it all, she sat at the piano in the community center, working on a new piece. This one didn't have a name yet. It was about second chances, about hands reaching out in the dark, about how kindness doesn't always come with fanfare. It often arrives in a to-go box, a folded blanket, a single rose left on a bench. She didn't know where this path would lead. College, music school, maybe just playing in cafes and shelters for the rest of her life. And that was okay, because she wasn't playing to eat anymore. She was playing because she had something to say, and now, finally, she had a place to say it. 6 months had passed since that rainy night, and the city felt different. Not because it had changed, but because she saw it differently. The same streets that once felt like a maze of cold shoulders and closed doors now held hidden pockets of warmth. The barista who saved her a seat by the window, the librarian who slipped classical CDs into her bag with a wink, the bus driver who always nodded when she got on, even if she only had exact change. She still lived at Horizon House. Though she was saving up for a tiny studio apartment with help from a housing program, she'd passed her GED, started taking online music theory classes, and played every Sunday at the coffee shop, now to a small but loyal crowd who came as much for the quiet comfort of her music as for their lattes. But today was different. Today, she stood backstage at the Riverfront Arts Festival, a real stage, with real lights, real sound equipment, and an audience that had paid to be there. Not a huge crowd, but enough to fill the outdoor amphitheater on a crisp spring afternoon. Families on blankets, couples holding hands, kids running between rows with ice cream dripping down their wrists. The kind of gathering where strangers smiled at each other like they shared a secret. She wasn't the headliner. She was the opening act, 20 minutes just after the local poetry group and before the jazz quartet. But to her, it felt like the whole world. Her hands were steady as she adjusted the bench. No shaking, no panic, just a quiet hum of readiness. She wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a soft sweater, her hair pulled back. No fancy dress, no makeup. She wanted to look like herself, because that's who they were here to hear. Backstage, the festival coordinator handed her a bottle of water. "You've got this," she said. Not as encouragement, but as fact. She nodded. "Thanks." She walked out alone, no fanfare, just a soft spotlight following her to the piano set up center stage. The crowd murmured, some recognizing her from the coffee shop, others curious about the quiet girl with the worn notebook tucked under her arm. She sat. For a moment, she just looked out, not at faces, but at the space between them, at the way sunlight dappled through the trees, at the little girl in the front row clutching a stuffed rabbit wide-eyed. Then she opened her notebook to a new page. Not Bread and Rain. That song had done its work. It had fed her, sheltered her, connected her. But this one was for now. She called it Still Here. It began with a single note, low, resonant, like a heartbeat waking up. Then another. Then a simple melody rose, not sad, not joyful, but honest. It spoke of mornings with hot coffee and clean sheets, of learning to trust a knock on the door, of finding your voice again after years of silence. Halfway through, she wove in a fragment of Bread and Rain, just a few bars like a memory passing through. Then it transformed, lifted by new harmonies, stronger now, like roots pushing deeper after a storm. People leaned forward. Not out of pity, not out of curiosity, but because they recognized something in the music, a truth they'd felt but couldn't name. When she finished, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was warm, sincere, the kind that says, "Thank you for sharing that with us." She stood, gave a small bow, and walked off to quiet cheers. Backstage, the music teacher from the community center waited, eyes glistening. She didn't say anything, just hugged her tightly. Later, as the sun dipped low and golden, she sat on a bench near the river, eating a slice of pizza from a paper plate. The festival buzzed around her. Vendors packing up, kids chasing bubbles, musicians loading gear into vans. She watched it all with a quiet smile. A woman approached holding a little girl by the hand, the same one from the front row. "Can I talk to you for a second?" the woman asked gently. The girl nodded. "My daughter." "She doesn't talk much," the woman said, glancing down at the child. "Not since her dad passed. But during your song she squeezed my hand. And after," she whispered, "that sounded like how I feel." Her voice cracked. "Thank you." The girl looked at the child, who met her eyes for just a second before hiding behind her mother's leg. But she didn't look away scared. She looked seen. "You're welcome," the girl said softly. "Tell her it's okay to feel things, even the quiet ones." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. As dusk settled, she packed up her notebook and headed home. Not to a van, not to a doorway, but to a room with a lock, a window that opened, and a small keyboard in the corner. On her desk sat a stack of letters, some from teachers, some from strangers who'd read the article or heard her at the coffee shop. One was from a youth shelter in another city, asking if she'd ever consider doing a workshop. She didn't have all the answers. She still worried about money, still had nights when the past crept in like a shadow, but now she had tools, community, a voice that didn't just survive, it sang. A few weeks later, she returned to La Note, not to play, not to ask, just to thank them. The same man who'd let her in that rainy night was working the door. He recognized her instantly, not by her clothes, she still dressed simply, but by the way she carried herself now, lighter, grounded. He didn't say, "Look at you." He just smiled and said, "We've got a table by the piano if you'd like." She sat where she'd eaten that first meal. The chef sent out a plate, same fettuccine, same garlic bread, but this time she paid for it. With her own money. As she ate, she glanced at the piano. It sat quiet, waiting. She didn't play. Not tonight, but she knew she could, and that was enough. Months turned into a year. She started volunteering at Horizon House, teaching basic piano to other young residents. She didn't call it lessons. She called it listening with your hands. Some kids came just to press the keys and hear a sound they made themselves. Others wrote songs about lost parents, broken homes, dreams that wouldn't quit. One evening, a boy who hadn't spoken in weeks played a clumsy but heartfelt melody. When he finished, the whole room clapped, not because it was perfect, but because it was his. She watched him smile for the first time, and her heart swelled. That's when she understood. Her story wasn't just about her. It was about what happens when someone dares to say, "I have something to offer." Even when the world tells them they have nothing. It was about the ripple. One act of courage, one open door, one shared meal, that can change the course of a life. Now, when she walks through the city, she doesn't just see sidewalks and storefronts. She sees possibilities. A bench where someone might rest, a cafe where music might heal, a stranger who might be one kind word away from hope. She still plays Bread and Rain sometimes. But now, it ends differently, not with silence, but with a single, rising note like a hand reaching back to pull someone else up, because that rainy night didn't just feed her for a day, it reminded her, and everyone who heard her, that beauty doesn't need a perfect stage, it just needs a heart brave enough to share it, and sometimes all it takes is 5 minutes to begin again.